Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism Midweek Special. Hope you and yours are well. This is the programme where we talk about things out with Scotland that will have an effect now or in the future. And of course, there's so much going on in the world, not just in the Middle East, but in Africa, and of course in Ukraine. And that's why we've called this particular episode The Forgotten War, because Ukraine is still going on, folks, and it's brutal, and there's people dying in their numbers. It's really a terrible shame, and it has to stop. But let me get my guests in to talk about this, and again about Gaza. Starting with Yvonne down there on the borders.
Hi, Roddy.
Hello, my friend. How are you?
I'm feeling slightly fragile after a visit to the dentist today, but and the remnants of Storm Aisha, which really hammered us down in the south of the country. Of course, such things don't bother you.
No. Although I believe there's another storm on the way tonight, which is something to look forward to. And as we're talking about weather, what a segue that is. Mr. Quinney.
How are you, Roddy?
Not bad. I wouldn't say you're typecast, but you're typecast, kind of.
Seems that way. That'll teach me to take
Well, certainly on Prism. And great over there, our very good friend of the show, Finbar Markey from over there on the Emerald Isle.
Hi guys,
Finbar, my friend, how are you?
I'm good. We haven't been on in a couple of months, and as you were saying, this war has been forgotten. So it'll be worthwhile, I think, just to have a review of what's been happening and where things are at now.
Sure, because that's exactly what's happened, Finbar. From October the 7th, it was as if the Western media got bored, the Western politicians, an occasional scrap here and there, but they've got fed up with it. But that's not stopped the killing, and it's getting worse.
At a schematic level, I think Gaza and what's happening in Ukraine and the wider developments in the Middle East do have certain shared schematic themes in them. But in terms of what's been happening in Ukraine, I think one of the last times I was on the program, Roddy, I had said that my expectation was that Ukraine would have 5, 6, maybe 7 weeks left of fighting it. And that was according to the reports that were coming out. I was wrong in that. They're still fighting. And I think one of the reasons that I'm wrong, and lots of other people were wrong in that, was that there's a madness in continuing this fight with the amount of loss and loss of life that has happened. And post October 7th, the amount of loss of life that has been happening. Again, the figures have risen up to some days 1,000, 1,500 dead on the Ukrainian side, and many more injured. I was trying to get an assessment of where we're at in terms of the killed in action and the casualty rate for Ukraine. And it's really difficult. There was a time there was more steadfast figures. Now I'm seeing figures from between the 500,000 to 700,000 killed in action, and many more casualties on top of that. People who may never work again, people who have mental health issues because of this, and they're not usually counted in the casualty figures either. In terms of the stratagem of it and where things are at on the front line, Russia and Russian forces are slowly moving forward. I had thought at the time, and I think when Bakhmut fell, most people thought that there'd be a big rush towards the Dnieper River. But that's not the case, and it seems to be slowly catches the monkey kind of a thing as far as the Russians are concerned. Avdiivka has essentially fallen over the last 48 hours, and especially the last 24 hours. So Avdiivka is a significant town midway between the top and bottom of the front line, if you want to put it like that. When we were on the show a few months ago, we were speaking about Avdiivka then and the likelihood of it falling, and the coke plant area at the north had been taken, I think, at that stage. But they've held on. They've continued to put resources and reinforcements into Avdiivka, the Ukrainian side. But the Russians are now in the city center. And one telling thing that happened over the last 24 hours that facilitated the Russians getting into the city center was the use of an underground pipe. And this is very telling. about who is planning and strategizing at a senior level on the ground on behalf of Ukraine. We have, well, I presume, a general oversaw the development of the fortifications in Avdiivka. And we've all been told from both the Ukrainian and the Russian side that, and sources, that Avdiivka, some people were comparing it to Bakhmut in terms of the fortifications that the Ukrainians had built there. Last night, the Russians used a pipeline, an existing tunnel pipeline for 2 kilometers that went under all the fortifications and went into Lenin Street and other streets in the center of Avdiivka. And the question has to be asked, when they were building the fortifications, did nobody ask what's underneath us? You would think that that would be a standard part of planning, and I expect it is. But I think this is showing that the people who are in the senior planning and application level now on the ground and the front lines are people who would have been in junior positions at the beginning of this war. But an entire generation of men has been wiped out, and an entire generation of soldiery has been wiped out. Last month, as an example of the desperation in terms of being able to put personnel on the front line, last month, and I think Roddy and maybe Lloyd, you saw too, and maybe even Yvonne, a video from the front lines in the trenches as explosions were going off of a man with Down syndrome in a Ukrainian uniform with a stick in his hand, while other Ukrainian soldiers who were fully armed were appeared to be belittling and making fun of him. So that's who they're recruiting in Ukraine. We get shocked when we're told they're recruiting women. Lots of women who had stayed in Ukraine, it's reported now, are trying to flee because they're up for conscription as well. The conscription teams, you may remember about a month and a half, 2 months ago, there was a big deal made about cleaning out the conscription teams, getting rid of all the senior officer levels because of the bribery and their lack of success in getting the numbers required. Well, the recruitment teams and the resistance to them seems to be growing. In the past, I've seen videos of people running away. Over the last few weeks, I've seen videos of people shooting members of the conscription teams, physically attacking members of the conscription teams. And it seems to me that the civil society in Ukraine have just about had enough. There seems to be a development, an organic development of resistance. But on the other hand, my understanding of Ukraine is it's as bad now as 1940s Berlin under the Gestapo. It's as bad as now as early 1950s, late 40s, the Soviet Union under the KGB. That's the situation for the people in Ukraine. So being able to do something about this and rise up, there's individual acts that we're seeing on videos, but being able to, in an organized fashion, resist what's going on in Ukraine. The people in Ukraine, I think, are living in fear at this stage in terms of being able to do that. Last night, there was a missile bombardment from Kharkiv, on Kharkiv and on Kiev, again, focusing on personnel as much as supplies and ammo now. This is a little bit problematic for me because quite often the Ukrainians are putting personnel in buildings that are essentially civilian buildings, in hotels, which are in residential and business areas. And although in war, you can almost excuse anything, or some people would try to excuse anything, although I understand Russia's position, I personally would have concerns about taking those actions rather than waiting until that personnel is moved to the front line, because you are endangering civilians while you're doing that. But it's slowly catchy monkey. That's the situation now. Along the entire front line, Ukraine is moving forward. Down south in the Kherson region, where the Ukrainians have fought bitterly to establish a foothold or a bridgehead across the Dnieper River, and have lost possibly 30, 40,000 men in trying to create a small bridgehead. That's completely gone now. That's been wiped out. They're still trying to get over, but the actual bridgehead that they landed on is now gone. The situation is dire. And yet, I listen to unelected, especially EU politicians, von der Leyen, other people, talking and using the language of the victor in terms of Ukraine. And doing this so that they can get more funds, more weapons sent there for more people to die. That's my overall situation. So it hasn't really changed in the months, apart from Russia is now slowly advancing. There's less and less resistance on the part of Ukraine. If you look over in Iraq, as an example, the Iraqi resistance attacks on US bases and oil refineries and things like that. The Patriot missiles that were launched, I think it was 20 or 30 Patriot missiles launched in one event last week. American Patriot missiles, most expensive air defense missiles you can get. The Americans are telling the Ukrainians they can't give them any. They don't have any left to give. Now they're firing them off in Iraq. And the overall global situation, to my mind, is that between Ukraine, between supplying Israel, between supplying their troops in Iraq with heavy missiles,
Taiwan,
they're running out. They've nothing left. The British government have come out, Navy, and said that they basically don't have a functioning Navy anymore. And remember, if they're saying that, what is the actual truth? It must be a lot worse if they're saying that publicly. So I see in Ireland in 1916, it was taught that, England's problems are Ireland's opportunities. And I think that kind of attitude is being shown around the world now, where the West is under serious both military pressure, but also fiscal pressure, financial pressure. And Ukraine was a big part of that. That was a gaping cancer in using up the energy of the West. But the situation is in Ukraine that they're losing. They've lost the American money. There's some European money being committed. We have places like Germany and France now giving security guarantees, which appears to be security guarantees to the future Ukraine, not the current Ukraine. So whatever the future Ukraine is going to look like. So it's all a loss for Ukraine. The sooner they sit down and negotiate in a realistic manner. Zelensky is still making ridiculous demands before he sits down to a table, that the Russians withdraw all troops completely back into former 2022 Russian territory. So,
but he's also saying he wants Crimea and he wants reparations and he wants Putin and all his senior generals put in The Hague before they will talk to Russia.
Well, there's just one more point, and then I'll close up on the overview. There seems to be, in the poisonous, most toxic days of Rome, the Caesar always had people talking behind his back, but also planning and scheming behind his back. And it would appear that's happening now in terms of both Zelensky, but also Zaluzhny, who's the head of the Ukrainian army. So there was talk over the last 48 hours of Zaluzhny privately being fired, and this other guy who is a total CIA hatchling, this guy taking over the military. A guy who I'm told, I've read about, is so nuts that he would actually create a nuclear event to win if he had to. And apparently Zaluzhny would not go that far. He's more of a professional military man. You've got bitching and backbiting in Kiev with Zelensky and Zelensky's opponents. We saw, I can't remember, Tymoshenko, no, the blonde lady from the so-called Orange Revolution. Do you remember the Orange Revolution all that time ago? That blonde lady, she's back on the scene. She's trying to seem like she's talking sense. But what they're doing is a kind of type of populism, where now the political leaders are pointing up to the people, as you mentioned earlier, I think it was Roddy, the people partying in Kiev, and pointing up and saying, why aren't their sons and daughters being sent? And so this is a type of populism, but this is the type of populism that comes before a fall. This inside backbiting and old heroes coming back. That's the sign of a fall.
Yeah, it's getting quite worried. Techie, can you stick up or Mr. Guy Verhofstadt, his tweet of yesterday? Here it is. Putin hopes the rest of Europe doesn't have the resolve and grit to support Ukraine for a long war. To support Ukraine until it military defeats Russia on its territory, Poland leads the way. We have to prove Russia wrong. Isn't it easy, Lloyd, for these people sitting in Brussels or Warsaw or London or Washington to say, yeah, lads, charge, when not one of their people are dying? And as Finbar's told us, this is a one-way street war.
Mm-hmm. It's, it's always the same, Roddy. The politicians are always prepared to use other people's sons and daughters, but seldom use their own. It's easy from the gilded cages of Brussels and Strasbourg to make statements about other people's children and about other countries. But what strikes me most of all is this Russophobia that is central, completely central to the European Union's approach. And it strikes me that it's hollow and it's false. And I don't get the sense that ordinary people are going along with it in any way. I think also Mr. Verhofstadt really should not comment on military matters because he clearly does not understand them. It was interesting, some of the things Finbar was saying. I think those of us, including Finbar, who have examined normal Russian military practice, we fully expected that the Ukrainians would probably be beaten, probably by Christmas, but if the Russians had stuck to the standard practice that they've used in the past, for instance, in Chechnya. Now, what's clearly happening from the Russian point of view is that they are not exercising the full power and the full might of their army, their air force, and their navy. They're taking things, as Finbar said, in a very slowly catchy monkey kind of a way. And what that says to anyone who properly understands the Russian approach in these matters is that the Russians are leaving the door open for talks every day, each day, every day of the week, every week of the month. And that's clear in their strategy and the manner in which they're going about this. Whereas on the other side, it's like watching a Tsarist army. It's like, Russian military theory of 1914. Ukrainians are driving their people into a meat grinder. It's making it easy for the Russians to do what they're doing. And as a result of that, the quality of leadership that they have has more or less completely collapsed. But the most shocking thing about all of this is, a year ago, we could not move in the streets or in schools or in the workplace or indeed outside our parliament where there wasn't a blue and yellow flag being put up. It was day and daily bits of the school kids are going to collect for Ukrainian children. The school kids are going to, go on a sponsored walk for the Ukrainian children. People are making camouflage nets. People are organising, food convoys. All of that's come to a halt. All of that has kind of stopped. You still see, in some ways, kind of tattered. I saw one in North Berwick the other day, a kind of tattered Ukrainian flag hanging forlornly from a flagpole on the beach, and thought to myself, that about sums up where we're at now. It's tragic. But the key thing to remember is, in the same way as thousands of human lives are being extinguished in Gaza and the West Bank of Palestine, hundreds of thousands of lives have been extinguished on the banks of the Dnieper and right across Ukraine and the Donetsk. And for the world to turn a blind eye to this in the same way as they've turned a blind eye to what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in the Central African Republic, what's happening in an awful lot of countries, we need to get back to thinking in terms of talking and not bombing.
I agree. Yvonne, we've spoken about this before, but for example, the ICJ case, where we all went to the television to find that we couldn't hear what the South Africans were saying until we went to Al Jazeera. In Ukraine, it's the exact same. And I would say to the viewers watching this, if you don't have a Telegram account and you really want to keep up to date with what's going on there, I would suggest you get Telegram. And it's not sanitized like YouTube or Instagram. It's the full blood and gore. And I think if more of you look at that, you might be like me and become an anti-war fanatic. But so the people are not getting the full exposure. They're not getting the truth about the war of attrition that's going on. And they're still being led to believe that, the Russians are not very well trained, not got very good equipment, and it's just a matter of time, and the sanctions will bite, throw some more soldiers at it. But the truth is being kept from the people, as it is in Gaza and in Palestine, but especially in Ukraine. Is it not, Yvonne?
Well, we're not being told the truth because the media is in the hands of the fools who are creating and financing these wars. The thing that struck me was a report in one of the papers to say that the doomsday clock has been left at 90 seconds to midnight, reflecting the continuing and unprecedented level of risk to the world today. And humanity is in the most dangerous place that it has ever been. We've become hardened to war. Putin must be laughing his socks off at the moment at what is happening, and I don't think the full might of the Russian army is being deployed. I think he's actually holding back because Lloyd mentioned Chechnya. Chechnya was razed to the ground, Gaza style. This is the way the Russians fight. They've just got this scorched earth policy. But at the moment, they seem to be almost toying with the Ukrainians in the way they're fighting this war. And I think that quite a lot of recruits that are wearing uniforms aren't up to the task. They're relying far too heavily on might is right, and weapons will get them out of the situations that they're in. And I don't believe that the weapons will. I think that we're just in a terrible situation where Ukraine has become the forgotten war. All the gung-ho headlines haven't really lasted well. And Ukraine was being talked about as a forgotten war last March, nearly a year ago, and nothing has happened. If I was Zelensky, I would be incredibly worried by now. And of course, the Israelis have brought to us a new level of brutality in war that is actually not doing any favors at all to the Ukrainians, and the way that their war is being fought. What I'd love to know from Finbar is, I'm getting lots of feedback from friends in Ireland at the moment that Joe Biden is just dropped in popularity in Ireland, and that St. Patrick's Day is going to become quite a politicized event as a result of Biden and his awful wars.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think the St. Patrick's Day event itself will be politicized in Washington, because the Irish politicians who usually go over there are sycophants, and they just go over to prove the length of their tongue. It will happen irrespective of what the Irish people feel. Ireland is no different. I see a lot of stuff going around about Ireland and its support for the Palestinian people. That is true. But not our politicians, not our governing politicians. That's not the case with them. And in fact, Leo Varadkar, who's our man in command again for the second time, leader of one of the smallest parties now. The opinion polls have them so low at this stage, but he came out over the last 48 hours and said that it would be wrong to support the case in the ICJ against Israel because it might be an insult because of the Holocaust. Just so if somebody ever has been a victim to any type of crime in the past, they get off scot-free for any crimes they commit into the future, according to that logic. Can we just step back to something that Yvonne was saying there about the Russians using their full capacity, and she doesn't believe they're using the full capacity? I think it's important to conceive the notion that there's a very, very, very high probability that the Russians have a war plan for the next 10 years that involves the West invading them, going over their own borders, because the language coming out of some senior EU politicians in particular, elected and unelected, is saying we will be at war with Russia within 2 years. Some other people are saying we'll be at war with Russia within 3 years. Some are calling for war with Russia now. Tusk moving in and getting the premiership of Poland is a very, very dangerous and telling event in terms. So he just was in and sitting his arse in the seat when it was announced that the Germans will be sending, I think it's 80,000 troops plus over to the Russian-Polish border, have been invited by Poland. So it's building up, and there are insane people out there holding the steering wheel who want to drive us right off the cliff. And so Russia is making plans, contingency plans, for the worst case scenario. And that will involve full mobilization of the population, most likely, which we could never match in any way, especially in Europe. But that's why even now I believe that they're holding back in terms of their current military forces and personnel numbers, because they don't know what's coming. Simple as that.
We've all seen, Finbar, on social media in Ukraine, how these recruiting officers are going into clubs and pubs and anywhere, and pulling people off the street and firing them up to the front. They're not having that problem in Russia. I read an article when they started the SMO, the Special Military Operation. They had 120,000 troops. There are now 600,000, of which about 400 are in reserve. Now, they're either in reserve or they're ready there, because they will start sweeping forward. But they have no recruitment problems, do they?
Let me tell you something. There's a film I watched a few weeks ago from 1985, a Russian film called Come and See.
Yeah.
And it's a story of a young boy in Belarus as the Nazis moved in and his experiences. He wanted to be a member of the partisans and he ran away with the partisans. But that got a bit messy because he wasn't trained. The partisans moved on without him. What himself and this young girl who comes in and out of the movie, what they go through. And since it was made in 1985, the boy is a young, fresh-faced, maybe 14-year-old at the beginning of the movie. He only goes through a few months in the movie. At the end of it, he looks like an old man. And if you go and look at modern Russian culture in terms of movies, especially movies about the Second World War, I'm not surprised they're lining up to join the army because of what they went through in the past, because of the West. Because the Russians always knew, Hitler said it, the West said it was their intentions at the time, that the Soviet Union and communism had to fall. And the West financed certain parties in Germany in the 1930s because they were most anti-Russian and most anti-Soviet. Certain parties, and we all know who we're talking about here. And so the Russians know this, and they know what our current intentions are. Not mine, but the West's current intentions are. So looking at modern Russian culture, and especially their movie culture, will give a good indication as to why they're so committed to joining up. 780 something villages, I think, in Belarus, maybe 680, 700, were destroyed and the populations annihilated by the Nazis. And what did the Americans do in 2014 and prior to it? They funded and supported Nazi groups to conduct a fake revolution in Kiev, supported by the CIA, by MI5, by MI6, whoever all the different intelligence agencies were involved. Nazis. The people that's the button you press for the Russians. You look at their modern contemporary culture and their movies, and you'll understand why they're resisting this as they're resisting and doing it happily.
No, there's also a lot of Nazi-leaning people, shall I say, in the Baltic states as well, especially Estonia. Of course, they were on the side of the Nazis in the Second World War II.
So that film, just to recap, it's Come and See. It's available on YouTube, 1985, a must watch.
Yep.
Yeah, I've written it down here. I think I might have seen it actually. I'm not sure, but I'll look again. Lloyd, one of the other things, there's a lot of false narratives, as I say. There's going to be over, Biden was telling everyone, and the Americans were, anyone that would listen, that the sanctions would finish Russia and they would depose Putin, and it would be all over in weeks. And then it was, well, don't worry, we're going to put in these wonder weapons. These Western weapons are great because the Russian ones are rubbish. And they sent in Leopard tanks and Churchill, or not Churchill, what they call the British one, I can't remember. Challenger. Challenger. And the Abrams, which has got to stay away from the front line. These wonder weapons haven't worked. They're
nowhere near it.
No, but the problem isn't the problem here. The Russians are able to produce because they didn't deindustrialize. Our neoliberal people started in 1979 deindustrializing, and the whole entire West, the EU, the NATO, all of them can't keep up with Russia on production of weapons.
It's not just production of weapons, Roddy. You know, the sanctions that were going to cripple the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation has a GDP that is much higher than it was when the war started.
Yeah.
You know, the sanctions have failed entirely. And in a broader sense, another thing we've talked about before with Yvonne and with Finbar and yourself is this is giving support to the BRICS countries. You know, effectively, the division, the multipolarity that we've talked about, the diminishing of the European Union is happening directly as a product of a mad war that Verhofstadt and van der Leyen want us to carry on fighting. It's a truly extraordinary situation where, you know, we often say it. You know, who is it that who wins out of the war? The capitalists, the businesses. Who's winning out of this war? The Russian GDP is what's winning out of this war. And the fact is that none of the other countries, as you said, Roddy, none of the other countries have the basic industrial capability to challenge the Russian Federation. It's as simple as that. But also, you know, if the suggestion that came from that mad Norwegian admiral or captain or whatever he was the other day suggesting we'll be at war with Russia in 2 years, well, if the Western countries, NATO in particular, are dependent entirely on the Leopard tank, the Challenger tank, and the Abrams tank, then we're beat before we start. That's the simple, straightforward fact of it. Ukraine must be showing NATO that they cannot win this unless there is a sharp move to a nuclear confrontation. And something I've been meaning to say for a while now. Since the advent of the war in Ukraine, the concept of nuclear exchange has come back onto the agenda and is talked about as if a nuclear weapon is simply a big bomb. We're not paying real attention. There's an entire generation of kids who don't understand the nature of nuclear conflict. The fact that right at the very beginning of the Ukraine war, we had people, you know, on the Ukrainian side threatening to blow up nuclear power stations to stop the Russians coming. Now, we know from the one event that's happened in all our lifetimes, namely, well, it happened in Ukraine, that had effects that went as far as Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland and into the north and the south of Ireland, damaging the ground soil. In actual fact, there is a farm in Scotland that is still not allowed to produce out of 5 fields that were contaminated after the nuclear accident in the Ukraine. Now, how anyone can talk in terms of a nuclear exchange as if it's just a normal thing, that's not the world I grew up in. We grew up with an understanding that a nuclear exchange will lead to the collapse of civilization, and if not just that, possibly the end of humanity. We've got to get away from this idea that at some point you can dare even threaten to make use of nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. And another big problem, everyone, people don't understand again, because it is, as the guys have alluded to, it's follow the money. Because I noticed that Blinken, to justify getting more money out of Congress for Israel and again for Ukraine, was saying, but look, 90% of this money stays in America anyway, because it's going to the big military industrial complex companies who are not losing anyway, whose kids are not in the front line. They have not, but they're making huge money. And so the longer this war goes on, it will be fought to the last Ukrainian because the Americans are making money.
Blinken is like his predecessor, Colin Powell, who stood up before the UN and just lied. And Blinken used the same tactics just a few weeks ago when he was asking for more money for weapons in Israel. And he lied about the now infamous story about the 40 Israeli babies that were beheaded, that nobody has been able to come up with any proof. He stood there and he lied and he lied and he lied to these witless politicians who then gave the green light for more weapons to be given to Israel. You know, this is a war that is going badly wrong. And again, nobody's admitting to it. Just yesterday, Israel lost 24 soldiers in the biggest single deaths of Israeli soldiers since the war began, more than 100 days ago. Now, when the war started, Netanyahu said it was to get rid of Hamas. And as far as I'm aware, the senior leadership of Hamas is still very much intact. And the fighting now is the fiercest it's ever been. But with this increased fighting and Israel's failure to make an impact, I'm really worried about the threat of nuclear escalation, because Israel is a country with more than 200 nuclear warheads. I suspect they've got probably 10 times that number now. But Israel is mad enough and bad enough to be able to use those nuclear weapons, and which is why I think the Armageddon clock is getting closer and closer to the end of humanity. I just think that this is becoming more serious than ever, largely because of ignorant and gutless politicians who really, quite frankly, haven't a clue just how close the world is coming to a tipping point where death, destruction, and is going to leave parts of this planet dead for a very long time.
Yeah, it is shocking. On that, now that we've drifted into Palestine, Finbar, you know, the outrage it's shown by the Western globalists is that, you know, bad Russia for invading and we must support Ukraine because it's wrong to invade. They say nothing about Palestine, where the Israelis have invaded for 75 years. The hypocrisy is one of the things that really gets me angry, the hypocrisy and the double standards. And when it comes to Gaza and Palestine in general, that is just all the time.
We're long in the tooth enough, I think, to know that about those double standards, and long. I just should have turned that phone off there. We're long in the tooth enough to know about those double standards and to have identified them. I think what the problem. I think it's great to see it so overt and obvious to the members of the public right around the world who are for the first time seeing through this kind of stuff, and they may have not been fully informed or understanding about the Russia-Ukraine situation, but it's a no-brainer when it comes to what's been done to the people of Gaza. And it's opening up a Pandora's box for the political West, the political system in the West, which is being shown for what it really is now. And there's a lot of people who would have supported Leo Varadkar, Micheál Martin in the past in Ireland, maybe would have even given Rishi Sunak some kind of a leeway to make his mistakes. But when it comes to Gaza, people, the mass majority of people are seeing through this kind of stuff. And they're seeing the level of Zionist Israeli lies and deceit. And that being spread by their own Western media corporations. And for some people, for the first time, they're actually starting to notice. They reported this, but there was no evidence. They reported that, but there was no evidence. They can't completely blank out the ICJ. People can listen in and hear the actual evidence, which is incontrovertible. There's no arguing with it. Though the Zionists, of course, will argue with it. You know, they'd argue with their own nails. But but the situation in Gaza is horrific. I'm not sure if you said it at the beginning of the program, Roddy, or prior to us starting to record, but you were talking about the imagery that's coming out of Gaza, the bloodiness of children, sometimes in their dozens, hanging off what was a building, crushed between, and all you see is their little feet crushed between two blocks of cement. Just the imagery coming out. But as well as that, there's an imagery of a type of manhood that we don't normally talk about. When you see the young men in Gaza and middle-aged men in Gaza, while bombs are dropping down, going through the rubble to try to save people, save children, the respect to show for the dead bodies of children, that, to my mind, they're lions. They can't be described as anything else. Israel and the Zionists will do whatever they can to devalue those people in our minds. But when you see that bravery, and they're not carrying guns, they're carrying dead children.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Techie, can you stick up the UN General Secretary's comment about Gaza and Palestine? The nightmare is more than a humanitarian crisis, it's a crisis of humanity. I couldn't have put it better, Lloyd.
Yes, absolutely. And most especially given that we're awaiting the judgment from the ICJ. And that will be the clearest statement of whether or not we retain humanity as a race, as a human race, not as individuals and not as nationals of any particular country. If there is interference in the ICJ, if they do not come back with an instruction for Israel to cease and desist immediately, then international law is gone and done. And the implications of that are quite frightening, particularly given we've just been discussing the potential and possibility of nuclear confrontation. All the laws on nuclear weapons possession, most of which are ignored by the big five countries, but respected by most countries in the world, that will go to pieces. That there will no longer be the ability to say this is wrong, this is right. We will have abandoned completely any sense of a public discourse on the concept of good and evil. That's ultimately what we're talking about here, because international law was created to prevent events of evil, given the experiences we had in the mid-20th century. Moving forward just now, though, I agree completely with Finbar. I think that and it's one of the benefits of the advent of the world of social media is that people are beginning to see through the lies perpetrated, particularly in these islands where, you know, the BBC, ITV, and even unfortunately since the removal of Mr. Snow, Channel 4 is poodling the same lines as Sky and up to a point RTE is as well. But people will waken up to this. You cannot kill people in the numbers that it's happening. I mean, we're 25,000 people, 10,000 of whom minimum are children. 10,000 small lives entirely snuffed out. And at the same time, we have to listen to the spokespeople of the Israeli Zionist regime telling us things like, well, if we don't kill them now, when they grow up, they'll come and kill us. Now, that's become part of an accepted conversation amongst Israeli society. And the fact that we are now beginning to see that that's the manner in which they think about fellow human beings, it takes us back to the darkest parts of the slave trade. You know,
it's Nietzschean, isn't it?
Yes.
You used a phrase earlier. I think you used the four words "beyond good and evil," and a moment ago, which is Nietzsche, one of Nietzsche's books, in which he argued that there's a certain class or type of people who are so superior that good and evil doesn't apply to them. Yeah. They can do as they wish. And this inspired the Nazis, etc. And equally, it inspires Zionists, I believe. Yeah. But there's also another German, I know Nietzsche's Austro-German, but there's another German philosopher, a German Jewish philosopher, Hannah Arendt, and she wrote about the banality of evil. And when I look at the likes of Blinken and the likes of the administrators and those people who stand at the Pentagon podium and the White House podium. There's an Asian man there. There's what's his name? Kirby, and a few of those. They remind me of Hannah Ardent's The Banality of Evil. Suited, they look like it's just normal day in the office. They're just explaining what's happening, never get heated, never get upset by anything. There's a banality of evil there, as well as this beyond good and evil attitude that the Zionists have. So two German-orientated philosophers totally opposed to each other, but they seem to be aligning in this.
Yeah, the thing is, Yvonne, you're right that the Israelis thought this would be a 2 or 3 day job, just the same as the West underestimated what would happen in Ukraine with Russia. They seem to think a few days and they'd wipe the place out. And well, I don't know if they're losing. They're certainly not winning the war, but they're withdrawing troops. They're now, it looks as if they're trying to suck the Americans in by any way they can. And now they're talking about attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, well, no, I'm not a military man, but I am led to believe by looking at alternative media, Hezbollah are not they're not a pushover by any means. And if that goes, will that bring in America? Will America stand back, or will that give them their opportunity for those war hawks to attack not just Hezbollah, but also attack Iran and this to escalate?
Well, I really believe that Israel is determined to win at any price, at any cost, and they don't care who they drag into this war. And you know, they're struggling at the moment to contain Hamas, and yet they've opened up a new front by bombing Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. And you're quite right, you know, Hezbollah is quite a different sort of outfit to Hamas. And they have friends in Russia, in Syria, in Iran, and the possibilities of who will attack who if somebody attacks Hezbollah are absolutely frightening. And I think that it's down to world leaders to show some form of restraint. Gutierrez is quite right, and he has been on the money since his outspoken early days. But I'm really not sure where we're going to get any true leadership from. We certainly will not get it from the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations for the Commonwealth, as he's called. Ephraim Mervis wrote an article in the Telegraph just a few days ago. And, you know, we look to spiritual leaders to show some restraint and exercise some wisdom. And yet, I'm sorry, but I just had to listen to him, and I thought if any Muslim preacher stood up and said half of what he'd said, he would be arrested by now. So what we're really lacking in the world today is leadership, restraint, and guidance. And again, for us living in Scotland, it highlights the desperate need for independence, because those crazy fools in Westminster who refuse to vote for a ceasefire and yet are quite happily voting to bomb the hell out of Yemen because of the actions of Houthi rebels who haven't killed anyone, by the way. I really, really despair. The world is lacking leadership. It's lacking courage and moral fiber, and we are not getting it from the elected fools in Westminster. In
Roddy,
fact,
can I just say something? You know, last week, it looked like there was going to be a real escalation when the Hezbollah made the attack on the Mossad headquarters in Syria, and then the attack on the ISIS stroke Mossad headquarters in Pakistan. And that looked like there was going to be an escalation between Iran and Pakistan, and it was all dealt with within 3 days, to the point where you saw the two foreign ministers shaking hands. Now, that to me, there's something going on underneath that we're not seeing, because you certainly couldn't say of Pakistan that it has an upright and moral leadership, or that it's shown any kind of leadership in the world, especially not after the arrest and jailing of Imran Khan. But the simple, straightforward fact that there was an exchange, a very serious exchange with large casualties on both sides, but within 2 or 3 days, suddenly everything's okay. I think that the idea of escalation is what Israel wants, but what all the countries on the other side are doing is to calm down that escalation. The simple fact that you have, nuclear powered and armed Pakistan fronts up against Iran, Iran fronts up against Pakistan, but within 3 days, they've suddenly found some common ground that says, let's not go any further. Was that the indication that they recognize that what Israel is doing is trying to play America, Europe, and the United Kingdom into extending the war? And effectively what they said was, leave us out of it. We want no further extension.
Yeah.
I think they were scratching each other's back in terms of, so the both attacks were on what each domestic country would have described as terrorists within their country. So the Iranians were attacking in Pakistan. Terrorists they claimed were a part of the attack the previous week in Iran, and then Pakistan attacked terrorists who operate on their territory who were based in Iran. So it seemed to be a back scratching exercise there. In terms of Hezbollah, and I think it's Ansarallah, is that the leader's name? I find it hard to recall these things. When Israel started to pound some of the towns in Hezbollah, maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, at the very beginning of this, and maybe longer, maybe 7 or 8 weeks ago, there was an expectation. Everybody was waiting in anticipation for the leader of Hezbollah's speech. And he came out and gave a very, very grounded speech in which he spoke about not wanting escalation, when he spoke about trying to, calm the situation down and not to escalate. So we're told that these are all the mad barbers and the mad Ottoman coming with their sabers to attack the West and destroy the West. But they seem to have a hell of a lot more sense. Can I just make one more point about Hezbollah? There was a bit of a comparison earlier done between Hezbollah and the Hamas in Gaza. If you look at Electronic Intifada and the work they're doing and looking at the tactics, because there's been a massive rise in the digital networking skills of Hamas. So they're going in, and every single action they take, the video with. And they have spotters around. So every action has a cameraman goes with it now. And you can see what they're doing, and as they're doing it, walking right up, crawling up to Israeli tanks, putting devices on them, walking away, pressing the button, destroying the Israeli tank. And the war is terrible. But the context of the bravery of these fighters and the strategies and tactics that they use, which does not require heavy equipment. So at the most, they might have a drone overhead, watching the Israelis down here. They've got a guy operating the drone. They've got 2 guys in the building opposite. They've got the anti-tank gun, whatever they're using. And they communicate in a triangle with each other to carry out each attack. And it's very coordinated. It seems to be working, especially in this heavily dense building urban area in which a lot of the buildings are hanging off or half destroyed or fully destroyed. So I think Hezbollah and Hamas, they're 2 different animals. But in terms of what each one does, they're top of their game.
For sure. I mean, the other one, well, who's not at the top of the game? This is not the same Israeli army in 1967 fought in what, 4 or 5 different fronts and won it in 6 days, and started this whole occupation of Palestine going, shall we say? Or even in the 70s, when they once again were up against several Arab countries. This is an army that's not fought in years. They've been doing policing and attacking people who've got no weapons, no air defences, and suddenly they're in a fight and they don't like it.
To me, when I look at Israeli soldiers, they're so busy putting themselves on Twitter and TikTok and things like this, and they're so dandified. You know, like, I have no doubt that at least 50% of those soldiers going into Gaza have a little tub of moisturizer here just in case. Just in case. I just know they have. But you look at the Hamas, they're going around barefoot sometimes. They're just light sneakers, no protection whatsoever, and they're doing what they were set out to do. I've seen videos of when Israelis have been attacked, and some of them actually scream. Some of the Israeli male soldiers scream, and they're just terrified. Because again, the problem is that they're believing their own counter propaganda and counterintelligence. So they're being told Hamas are vicious animals. This is what they're hearing in their own media all the time. They rape, the murder, the bludgeon. They're terrified to get caught by these guys. Absolutely terrified, even though they'd just be taken hostage and would be fed and everything else. That's been proven. That this counterintelligence that the Israelis are using on all of us, their own soldiers are falling for it. And they're absolutely terrified from what I can see.
Yep. There certainly is no Mush Dianes in among them, that's for sure.
No.
The old one-eyed general, he was a guy. On your point, actually, I would like to take it a bit further, Lloyd. Talking about, the ICJ, if it doesn't come across, we've lost international law. There's talk of the Americans giving 300 billion of frozen Russian assets over to Ukraine, which would absolutely destroy the financial industry completely. It would be no surprise to me if the global south and the BRICS nations turned around and said, you know what, America, EU, Europe, go on with it. We're going to set up our own institutions. We're going to have our own rules, and you just do what you like. We're having nothing to do with it. It wouldn't surprise me for 1 minute.
I think it's looking into the future, Roddy. You know, nothing, and I say this fairly regularly in the programme, is nothing stays the same. You know, the European Union was never going to exist forever, you know, in the same way as the League of Nations didn't last very long. Are we seeing the bitter end of the United Nations, or will we see a reinvigoration of the United Nations if we get the right result from the ICJ? But I just get the impression that we have so many amateur politicians in very important well, amateur is not a way to call them. The politicians who are there at the behest of vested interest. And as a result of that, we have not got clear thinking. I mean, I was in a chat with somebody the other night who said, you know, what we need is one strong leader who just appear and, you know, sort everything out like some magic Harry Potter wizard. We don't live in that world. I look around and I think to myself, who are the statesmen? Where are the statesmen and women? Are their voices being quashed? For instance, that was a tremendous diplomatic and international law coup for South Africa to do what it's doing, but we're not being given, you know, Cyril Ramaphosa as a suggestion of a world leader who can draw things together. But the real fear is that if you break international law, the most important international law, which is about the protection of civilians, the ICJ case, if you ship Russia's held money to the Ukraine, then you blow all the economic rules, the international economic rules, right out the water. And that's a perfect circumstance for BRICS to set up its own structures. But maybe, Roddy, you're simply seeing into the future. Nothing, you know, BRICS needs to formalize itself into something more than simply something there where they gather together to make deals with each other. They need to become not necessarily a European Union, but they need to have similar structures and interact with the international structures as if they were a solid trading bloc.
Absolutely. Another thing that's come to mind this week, Yvonne, and I'll finish off on that, is that Hungary, who have been one of the sensible voices in the EU about not supporting weaponries and money to Ukraine, saying they won't act against it, they won't stop buying Russian energy for a start, Hungary, but they're using their veto to stop the European Union sending more ammunition and arms and money to continue this war, a pointless war, as he puts it. But now the EU is talking about taking Hungary to the court to remove their veto and voting rights because they don't like their own rules, which say that all member states must agree. But as soon as they don't agree with the globalists, we're going to take away your voting rights. It's quite disgusting, isn't it? And very anti-democratic. You're on mute, Yvonne. Quids are rolling in.
Yeah, well, I mean, you talking about democracy, and I would just say, what democracy? There is no democracy. If you're looking at the world today, the millions of people that are going out on the streets who are anti-war are not being listened to by the elected politicians. So if the people have no voice and they have no power or influence in any of the governments in the West, this is going to lead to a new world order. It has to. And I think that a lot of countries now in Europe are probably looking quite enviously towards BRICS and thinking, I wish we'd held off, and that's where we need to be. I think that this war in Gaza in particular has exposed the thin veneer of pretense that there is in the West today, that the West is civilized, that the West promotes peace, that the West promotes democracy. This week, Guantanamo in occupied Cuba has been open for 22 years. A legal black hole where America dumps people without trial, without charge. That isn't civilized at all. There is no such thing, I think, now as Western civilization. And one of the most shocking aspects that has come out of Gaza today is the fact that Israeli soldiers have been looting and turning over 13 cemeteries in Gaza and exposing the dead and searching and looting and pillaging among the dead. And you think, my God, not even the dead in Gaza can rest in peace. What do they think that they are up to? Their mantra for the last 100 days or so is that Hamas is ISIS, and the reality is, it is the IDF that is acting like ISIS, that is going into graveyards and ripping open tombs and defiling the dead. It is ISIS and that looted antiquities. And that is exactly what the Israeli soldiers have been doing. And they're not even trying to hide it. The IDF headquarters apparently is full of looted antiquities in glass cases from Gaza. And the whole world is just turning upside down. The IDF is acting like ISIS, not Hamas. The war crimes that are being committed in Gaza are being committed by the IDF, not Hamas. And the majority of public opinion is against this war in Gaza, and people are growing now more and more against the war in Ukraine. But the media and the politicians are continuing to fuel and fund and cheer on these wars. There is no democracy. We are living in dictatorship at the moment, and we're being told what to think, what to say, what to read, who to support, who to cheer on. And of course, behind all of this is the military-industrial complex,
Absolutely.
which is, getting rich on the back of these wars. And we're in a situation now where we're bombing Yemen, attacking because the Houthi rebels have been threatening global trade. They haven't killed anybody. They haven't bombed any schools, any hospitals, any religious places. But they are seen by the West as a threat. And by the West, that's code for the big corporations, big trade, global trade. We need to sort out our democracy before, we become part of this vile
Are we
dialogue.
caught in a whirlwind that we have no control over? Since 2022, February 2022, I've time and again been drawn to Yeats's The Second Coming, and especially the second verse that speaks about a beast possessed by the spiritus mundi, or the spirit of the world, or what Germans would call the zeitgeist. And there seems to be this toxicity, this nastiness, this inhumanity possessing the leadership of the world. And that falcon goes higher and higher in the gyre, as Yeats describes in the first paragraph, almost out of control. The falcon can no longer hear the falconer. There's just separation between sanity and what's actually happening. And that poem, especially the second verse, is just possessed, to my mind, of where the world is at right now. And this dread, this anxious dread that I think people, even the children of the world, are feeling, even though they don't understand what's going on, or even only half see what's going on. There's this anxious dread, this spiritus mundi that Yeats spoke about. And it's very, very worrying, because the falcon is so far from the falconer now. We have as you were making the point about democracy, no matter what we do, no matter what the opinion of the public, there could be 110% opinion poll about the public on an issue. The governments around the world, not just your government, not just mine, around the world in the Western sphere, will just do whatever they want to do anyway.
Yep. Because it's a fact. I think our politicians and our media have been captured by the Israeli lobby, by the military-industrial complex lobby, and by big pharma. That's just a fact. And we keep hearing the Americans talking about international-based rules. That you mean whatever you want to do, you just do. There's international law. Why don't you just stick with that, America? No, because that would catch you and your friends in Israel out. It really is. I'm just, as I said, and I've said it again, I'm delighted that all my children and all my grandchildren live in a BRICS country. And long may that continue. Yeah. Lady, gentlemen, can I thank you very much? The time clock is beaten as usual. We've overrun as usual. We could go on for ages. We will be back. To you watching, folks, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have, listened to these wonderful people giving us the benefit of their knowledge. And until we see you again, please take care.
Bye-bye, guys.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.